Hello, welcome to In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo. I'm also known as the Urban Birder, but today we're not talking about birds. We're talking about lovely little things like this. And they're called butterflies, by the way, in case you didn't know. And I just want to say that In Conservation with, which is a series of Zoom interviews with
Yeah.
movers and shakers around the world of conservation, and has been going for the last, what, 4 years now. So this is a sixth series. I've interviewed 180 different people. So if you wish to see some of the previous ones, just go along to my website, theurbanbirderworld.com, or to YouTube, the Urban Birder channel, and you will see all of them in their glory. So you got a whole plethora of information on different subjects to enjoy. In Conservation with, by the way, is sponsored by Cower Sporting Optics, and they are the purveyors and manufacturers of the world-renowned Promenade series of spotting scopes, and also Birds, Wildlife and Nature, the tour company that strives to deliver the best of birding and wildlife watching throughout the world. So thank you guys for sponsoring In Conservation with. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Pete Eeles. And Pete, how are you and where are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Dave. And sorry, David. And
You know
I am
what?
in.
People call me Dave from now and again. I used to be called Dave a lot when I was a kid. Then all of a sudden, I became a man and people started calling me David. And it's been like that ever since. But people call me DJ, all sorts of stuff. Yeah. Lindo,
Yeah,
Tub.
when people ask me if they should call me Pete or Peter, I say, well, you can call me Sir if you like, but Pete. Um, I am in Thatcham, which is near Newbury in West Berkshire. Lovely part of the world. Lots of nice species-rich habitats near to where I live. So yeah, nice place to be, and quite easy to get to most places in the UK, which is helpful too.
Okay. We haven't disturbed your band practice. I notice
Yeah,
there's
but I
an
might
array
might
of.
sing you a song later if yeah. So I play jazz guitar in as well as being a butterfly obsessive. So I play in a band. Yeah, it's not traditional jazz. It's sort of more modern jazz. But yeah, it's a bit of a passion as well.
So, in terms of, let's just quickly talk about this. In terms of your modern jazz obsession, what
Mhm.
musicians are you inspired by?
Um, well, it's people like Birelli Lagreen. I was actually tutored by a guitarist called Martin Taylor, who is quite well known in the jazz world generally, but especially in jazz guitar world, the jazz guitar world. But also love some of the oldies as well, like Django Reinhardt, and also listening to music that isn't guitar focused, like Miles Davis, Oscar Peterson. You need to go back to those people to understand the roots of jazz, and then you kind of come up through there and into blues and whatever style you really want to focus on. But yeah, just like chilling with my guitar, sometimes in the band.
You know what? Many people don't know this, but I could have had a different path in my life too, because when I was about six or seven, my mum enrolled me into music classes, and I was playing the trumpet, and I apparently was pretty good
Mm-hmm.
until I saw a picture of Dizzy Gillespie,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
thought, I don't want my eyes to pop out like that. So I actually stopped playing, and my music teacher didn't speak to me for 6 months.
Yeah, or cheeks like that because they were pretty inflated, weren't they?
Exactly. But I reckon I'm hoping in my next life to be a multi instrumentalist. So
Hmm.
watch out for me. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Now we're here to talk about butterflies, and I just want to find out, have I made the right choice here? Because I'm a birder, and my history when it comes to butterflies. In fact, as a kid, I was really interested in invertebrates. I didn't know anything about them. I was living in my house in Wembley, or my mum's house in Wembley, and I'd go in the garden and I'd bought a net that I bought from the local corner shop, which unfortunately wasn't fine mesh. So a lot of the butterflies I caught were without wings in the end. I have actually murdered a few butterflies, and I'm very sorry. I'll admit that now. But I love them, and as a birder, I can recognize a lot of things immediately. But I look at this and I was thinking, where did I take this? And is it by chance something British? And I hope it is.
It is a male silver-studded blue. and they are found in Britain. In fact, they're found in quite a few localities, and they're very, very variable. So sometimes the females, which are normally brown, have a lot of blue on them as well. But they are found normally on heathland in Britain, but some other locations as well. But they're actually quite widespread in Europe. So where were you when you took that picture?
You know what? I can't remember, but I reckon I was in Spain, if I'm honest.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that I was actually on Spanish soil when I took that picture. I just happened to see it fluttered by me, and I thought, you know what? Because recently I've been taking a lot of pictures of butterflies. Wherever I am in the world, I take pictures of butterflies, and I've got a whole sort of, you know, computer files full of butterflies I've never recognized.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Good.
Well, I just, you got to do you got to, you got to have a little interest there. In terms of your interest,
Hmm.
how did it develop? I mean, how did you kind of first get into the butterfly thing?
Yeah, so I grew up on the southern edge of the Cotswolds in Cheltenham, and it was very, very rich in wildlife generally. But my father was an ornithologist, and I had an uncle who was also really, really good when it came to wildlife in general, my uncle Fred. And they really fostered that interest. And because it was an area which rich in wildlife, I used to hang out with, all my friends would go down a disused railway line, and we'd be catching lizards and grass snakes and adders and all sorts of things, newts. And then I bumped into a couple of boys that were they were catching actually butterflies. So I hung around with them, and I just developed a fascination through sticking around with them. And then through that, following on from that, my mother worked with someone uh, who whose family ran a butterfly house in Bolton on the Water. So I got connected with them. I used to go and help them out on weekends, and then my eyes were open to the bigger world of actually there's a whole, you know, um, a very large group of people very interested in butterflies, but also entomology more generally. And I used to go to the Amateur Entomologist Society exhibition every year, and still do, some 40, 50 years later. And yeah, so it just mushroomed from there, really. Um, and so after, I got involved with school, found a girlfriend who I eventually married, and then went to university, did a degree, got a job. The wasted years, I call them.
May,
Had a
may I
family.
just may I just quickly interrupt you? When you found a girlfriend and got married, how did she take your interest in butterflies? Because I know when I was younger, if I told anyone I was into birds before I even started the next sentence, they'd been running down the road and out
Yeah,
of earshot.
I wasn't as obsessed as I am now back then. So she's very tolerant of what I do. Love it to bits. But yeah, I found the right person. That's all I can say.
Good. Um, just for those who know or don't know Pete, actually, I've got some more detail on you. Pete, you've always been interested in nature and butterflies in particular, as you said, fostered by a childhood spent in rural Gloucestershire. In 2002, you created the UK Butterflies website, which is ukbutterflies.co.uk, and is currently in the second stint of chair of the Hampshire and Isle of Wight branch of butterfly conservation. You were presented with the Marshall Award for the promotion of Lep, Lepidoptera,
Lepidoptera.
Lepidoptera um, conservation in 2016, and you have authored two butterfly-related books. We're talking about them today: Life Cycles of British and Irish Butterflies in 2019, as well as British and Irish Butterfly Rarities, which came out last year, 2023. Um, you retired from a 35-year career in IT, so that must have been good,
Mhm.
in 2022, and now works part-time as an independent ecologist and website developer. So you got a fair amount of skill sets there.
Yeah, it's quite varied. It's actually quite handy having the IT, the combination of the IT and the natural history and that interest as well, because there have been things that I've been able to help with and contribute to. because of that combination, like the UK Butterflies website, like helping several butterfly conservation branches with their websites. Um, with Butterfly Conservation as a Society, I also set up the original Garden Butterfly Survey website for them. So yeah, that knowledge of Lepidoptera in combination with the IT background has been quite useful. So yeah, carry on doing things that require that combination to a large extent as well. So, for example, I'm currently working as I say an independent ecologist. I'm helping a landowner who has 400 acres that he wants to manage specifically for butterflies and other wildlife, birds as well. He's got nesting goshawks on his property.
Wow.
It's one of the highlights. And I've helped him set up the website for his property when we actually launched an eco centre that hopefully will be developed there, but also just surveying things like white admiral, which is a butterfly, white admiral caterpillars each autumn, allows me to overlay the GPS coordinates of each sighting onto a map. And it's all very visual and easy to follow. But things like that then help guide the woodland management that needs to be done. So we had foresters that wanted to go and clear out an area that is full of the best honeysuckle, which is what the white admiral caterpillar feeds on. So we actually told them to not do that, go and do stuff elsewhere. But it was all driven by that visualization of the survey data that we could then give to them.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's yeah a good combination to have for me personally. It works really well.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to hybridize our skills because often you think of conservation and you just think, oh, I need a degree in whatever, and then that's
Mhm.
that. But I think, people who have many other skills can really inject a lot more into the whole of this. And plus, it's
Definitely.
really important to bring in outside sort of influences, which then enables people from the outside to be more engaged, because we have this problem in conservation, I'm sure in other disciplines where people just become so embroiled in a little area they forget that they need to appeal to people outside to keep the whole
Yeah.
thing going.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I agree. If you look at, it's quite interesting. So if you look at the trustees of many of the conservation organisations, the sorts of skills they bring are from their previous work lives in terms of finance or um, ethics, diversity, whatever it may be. And yeah, I think it's very healthy to use whatever skills you may have had in a previous life to
yeah.
do conservation. Yeah.
I'm trying very hard to shoehorn my DJing into birding, but it's just not working.
Don't know, you might attract a new audience.
On that note, let's have a look because you've prepared some slides for us. About butterflies and about your book, I suppose, essentially. But it'd be really interesting to get a handle on what we're talking about here, if that's possible, Pete.
Yeah, sure. It'll kind of level set what we're doing, I think. So this is a subset of quite a long presentation, but hopefully when this thing pops up, I'll be
Yeah,
able to.
for those who aren't familiar with watching presentations online, on Zoom meetings, just put your settings on speaker view. That's right, speaker view, and then you get the whole picture as opposed to a load of squares with a motley crew of squares with few names and people's pictures. Anyway, sorry.
That's all right. I mean, feel free to interject. Otherwise, this is just me presenting, I guess. But yeah, when I spoke with David initially, it was around this the fact that the latest book I'd written that had come out, and its focus was on British and Irish butterfly rarities. And one of the things I'll talk about is, well, what on earth's a rarity? But the subtitle kind of gives it away to some extent in terms of migrants, extinctions, and introductions. So I'll touch on some of this very briefly. The big blue butterfly you can see here is something called a long-tailed blue. This is a male. The female's got a sort of brownish effusion to her wings, and they have started to arrive pretty much every year now. Whereas 20 years ago it would be a once every 5-year event. So one of the things I'll touch on is climate change and some of the changes we're seeing as a result of that.
With that long-tailed blue, by the way, a friend of mine was really excited. He found one in Essex. He sent me the picture. Excited.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Um, yeah, I won't bore you with what's on the left, but blingy one is a Camberwell Beauty, as we know it in the UK. So let me. So this book is actually a companion volume to the first book I wrote, which David mentioned. So Life Cycles of British and Irish Butterflies. That book focused on what I would characterize as residents and regular migrants. So there are 59 species that fall into that category. And what you can see here on the cover is a white admiral that I mentioned earlier. So you can see the adult pumping up its wings, having emerged from its chrysalis. And then you can see the egg as you go clockwise, its caterpillar, which is quite spectacular, and its chrysalis or pupa. But it's one of my favorite butterflies, so that's why it's on the cover. And all of its stages are quite incredible, really. So as some of you may know, certainly David knows, once you've finished writing a book, there's a big lull in a sense of there's this vacant spot where you were spending all your time because you were busy writing a book. So a couple of years passed, and then I thought, well, maybe I should. And actually, it was Peter Marin who said when he reviewed this Life Cycles book, he said it's a shame he didn't include the long-tailed blue, and that kind of ate away at me. So in the second book, the long-tailed blue is included, but what the characterization of that book is rarities, of course. Now, the question is, where are all these butterfly species actually listed that you then select from? So rather than coming up with my own list of, well, I know there are rarities that, you know, because there have been extinctions, there are really, really rare migrants and so on, is just simply to conform to the checklist of Lepidoptera of the British Isles, which is now in its second edition, edited by David Agassiz, Stella Bevan and Bob Heckford. And in that checklist, you will find the 59 species that I wrote about in the first book, where I really go into some detail regarding their life cycles, describing every single stage, immature stages as well, and also every larval instar. And what I mean by that is that every caterpillar sheds its skin, and every skin it's in is an instar. So when it comes out of the egg, it's in the first instar. And when it changes its skin, it's in the second instar. And some species, their caterpillars are quite different as they change skin. So a swallowtail caterpillar will start off as something that looks like a little bird dropping, and then in the fourth instar will turn into something that is quite aposematic. It's got this warning coloration of green, black, white, and red markings on it. So anyway, I won't bore you too much with that. In terms of rarities, this checklist also covers some additional species. So there are 23 species in the checklist itself, and they can be characterized either as a rare migrant, so things like the Camberwell Beauty, which were on the previous slide, a monarch, which is I would categorize as a vagrant. And the difference between a migrant and a vagrant is really a stray or a wandering individual, whereas a migrant is something that arrives here as a result of a purposeful, directed flight in a particular direction, and they happen to reach the UK as a result of that. And then we have 3 extinctions as well, one of which is something called the large copper, which I'll touch on. The other 2 are the black veined white and mazarine blue. Just to conclude this checklist, there's also 2 appendices which contain some interesting things. There's what's called adventives. So these are species that have arrived in the UK but haven't got here under their own steam. So they might have been, you know, their immature stages were transported in food produce, or they arrived as a passenger on a ship. Or in the case of the geranium bronze, which I've listed here, they come across as normally as immature stages, so eggs, caterpillars, and pupae or chrysalises on cultivated geraniums, so pelargoniums that you know are found in garden centres and things like that. And a second appendix includes some species which are questionable, and these are often erroneous records. So one example is something called Albin's Hampstead eye, which is an Indo-Australasian species that most people believe was mixed up in a collection, but somehow made it onto the British list. And if you go back to the previous lists, you'll see it when it appeared, and it stayed there ever since. Anyway, the focus of the interest I developed after the Life Cycles book was actually around the 23 species primarily of the rare migrants, vagrants, and extinctions. and they're the ones that I classified as rarities. Um, One of the questions that I often get asked is, well, how do you know where things have actually come from? How do you know that they're a migrant and not a release? Because one of the things that we have to battle against is the plethora of releases of captive bred individuals. So you can actually buy livestock, rear it through, and then most people try and figure out what they should do with the adults, and they generally let them go. So you'll see all sorts of weird things appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time of year as a result of that. However, there are things that turn up, and you can kind of do some investigative work to figure out, see if you can determine their origin, their genuine origin as a result of weather patterns, for example. So one of the things you can do is create this thing called a backtrack. And in the picture on the right, this is a backtrack for a particular specimen of a butterfly called the monarch, which is found primarily in North America. And this was in 1999 when Hurricane Floyd was in the usual, areas in North America, so Florida and just north of that. And if you follow the path of Hurricane Floyd, what it does is it creates a series of depressions over the Atlantic, which drives not just butterflies, but dragonflies, birds off their migratory path. So rather than going north to south, they end up going west to east. So you can take a specimen of a monarch that's landed in Cornwall and say, okay, based on the meteorological conditions, where was it a day ago, and the day before that, and the day before that? And you can actually track it all the way back to its origin, which in this particular example was in North America. And that's how we know that the monarchs that we see sometimes are genuine migrants that have been blown off course, and therefore they're vagrants in terms of when they arrive here. And there are some obvious things, which I'm sure you've read by now, that you can also use to, you know, correctly determine whether or not things could get here appropriately. So there's, the speed being a combination of the butterfly's own speed and wind speed, that it's flying at the same altitude as the point of measurement of the wind speed, even though some butterflies do hitch a ride on faster air currents at higher altitudes, like the painted lady, which originates in sub-Saharan Africa but arrives on our shores most years, and so on and so on. But anyway, this backtrack I thought was quite interesting. I thought I'd just share that with you. And when you put all of that information together, you can then develop this picture of, okay, so of those 23 species, where are their likely origins? Now, the bulk of these, of course, come from mainland Europe, so our closest neighbours. So that big long list, starting with scarce swallowtail. But there are also I mentioned the monarch, but there's also the American painted lady, which is slightly different to the painted lady. The majority of those colonies, the bulk of the populations are in North America, but there are populations in the Micronesian islands. So, you've got the Azores, the what we're going down to the Canary Islands and the Maldives, just in between them, and also in Spain and the western edge of Portugal. There are also colonies of monarch and American painted lady. And we also get species which come in from the east, and the Camberwell beauty and scarce tortoiseshell are good examples of that. So if you actually look at the distribution data of specimens found in Britain, they're all scattered along the east coast. And that's how we know that the Camberwell beauty is actually coming from our east in Eastern Europe rather than from North America, where they're also found. So that's quite an interesting summary of where everything's come from. I also wanted to include this slide because there are two myths when it comes to migrants. One is I've seen a migrant, but it's undamaged. The other one is it's just flying around in the area where I found it. It's not being very migratory, is it? But back in 1945, when E.B. Ford wrote the first volume of the New Naturalist series called Butterflies, he actually explained why this is. So first of all, essentially the first paragraph says when a butterfly is flying over the sea and there are no obstacles, well, it's not going to damage itself, is it? Why would they? So it's only when they come across plants and so on that the damage is typically done. So they often get here in Britain as if they've just newly emerged. And secondly, to the point about migratory habits, well, the urge to migrate is quite different from the original habits when it was just emerged. And because of that, on arrival, they'll just settle down in an area and stay there. And their offspring may also just stay there. So when you find these very pristine migratory butterflies on the coast, then that's the reason why. So I thought I'd share that because that comes off very, very often. When I look at things on Facebook, I've always have to bite my lip when people, make these claims that it can't be a migrant because it looks too fresh. It's clearly a release. I just wanted to finish off by really going through some patterns. So I'm not going to go through every species clearly, but the patterns of things that we're seeing. One is extinction. Why have some of our butterflies become extinct in Britain? And I've said that there were three. There's a large copper, the black-veined white, and the Mazarine blue. The first reason is straight out habitat loss. So the large copper is a butterfly of Fenland. And before the fens around East Anglia were drained, there was an extensive area of fenland available to the large copper, whose caterpillars feed on water dock. And I can't remember where I got this outline from. It's probably Wikipedia or something like that, so maybe not the most reliable source. But that red line on the map indicates the previous extent of the fenland that was drained. And the reason it was drained is that the soil is very fertile. It's very sort of peat-like soil and great for growing food. So, over time, a lot of the fenland was actually drained. Now we're restricted to very, very small areas. Been quite a few reintroduction attempts of the large copper. And there is one that hopefully will emerge in the next decade around something called the Great Fen Project. But it really does, I think, most people realize now that it does require quite extensive patches of habitat to survive. That being said, there's a different subspecies than the one we had in Britain, found in the Netherlands, and it's also suffering there as well, where there are extensive patches of habitat. So maybe it's just simply climate change that's also affecting the large copper. And when it comes to climate change, another good example is the black-veined white, which was another butterfly that's become extinct. It's quite common on the continent, actually. It was formerly found in it was quite a widespread butterfly, but the clusters were around southeast Wales and Gloucestershire, in the New Forest and in Kent. And it's generally thought that the butterfly died out because it was unable to survive mild and damp winters. So rather than having, very hot summers and very cold, harsh winters that we were previously used to, that this butterfly overwinters as a third instar caterpillar, and that does not do well when conditions are mild and wet, because that fosters things like viral and bacterial diseases. We don't actually know if that's the reason for the loss of this butterfly, but the climatic conditions, so climate change, is clearly having an effect, or had an effect, on this butterfly. That's the general consensus. The good news is there are a couple of reintroduction projects underway, so hopefully they'll bear fruit in the fullness of time. And then moving on to migrants, again, we have different patterns that we see with different species. So this butterfly, called the Queen of Spain fritillary, has had a fairly constant presence on our shores going back to the 1850s. So, appear in one year and be absent the next, appear again and be absent the next. And that pattern has pretty much continued. So, it has a good year on the continent. Some may arrive if the weather conditions are right, and some years, if the weather conditions aren't right, they don't appear. So that one is fairly flat, unlike some of the others I'm going to show you. So another pattern are the bursts of activity that you sometimes see. So the Camberwell Beauty has certain years where you get a bit of an explosion of sightings. The most recent one in 2006. And this is not largely down to weather patterns, of course, but also conditions where they originate. So if their numbers build up sufficiently, then they will actually migrate westward across northern and actually end up in the UK. And we'll see them scattered along the east coast and then move inland as they reach us. What other patterns have we got here? Ah, right. So this is even more interesting. So if you look at this continental swallowtail, so the swallowtail butterfly is actually resident in Britain. It's found in the Norfolk Broads, and its larval food plant is milk parsley. It's got quite a specific food plant that it uses. But the continental swallowtail, there's a debate as to which subspecies it may or may not be, but I'll call it Gilganus for now. It has uses a wide variety of food plants. And one of the analyses I did was if I take all of the sightings of swallowtails, continental and British, and then remove all of the sightings from the Norfolk Broads, where our subspecies is found, then you actually see the pattern that you have on the right here. And what you can see is that the numbers of sightings is increasing year on year. And it's thought that this butterfly was actually a resident a long, long time ago in the 1800s. If you read some of the early reports from the entomologists of the time, they would mention the swallowtail as a resident species. And the hope is that the butterfly will actually recolonize Britain. I mean, there's no shortage of food plants. It feeds on fennel and wild carrots, hardly rare things in our landscape. So hopefully, as a beneficiary of climate change would be the continental swallowtail. And that's also true of the long-tailed blue as well, which feeds on various plants in the pea family, such as broad-leaved everlasting pea, bladder senna, and things like that. Then we have vagrants, which I've already mentioned. So I've mentioned the monarch specifically. That was the one that was tracked using the backtrack. It is, one of the seven wonders of the world, as far as I'm concerned. It's a migration in North America where it finds its overwintering sites in Mexico and then goes on a reverse journey the following year. But if you look at the sightings in Britain and Ireland, then you can see they're concentrated in the southwest, whether that's in Ireland or in England. So that again suggests a west to east movement. I'll probably finish on this slide, David. I know I had a couple of others, but it'd be nice to have a chat and get your thoughts. But just, what does the future hold? Well, in summary, I think, as far as some of our migrants are concerned, we'll see things maybe become extinct, but hopefully we'll have things that arrive, such as the southern small white, which is shown here at the bottom, very similar to our own small white. Used to be a species only found in southern Europe, but it's been moving northwards apace and is now found quite frequently in the Netherlands now. And hopefully it will jump across the channel and make its way to Britain. So that could be our next new species to arrive. But if you look at the pattern of migrants, you can see that, as I mentioned, the change is fairly flat in terms of some species, such as Queen of Spain fritillary and Camberwell beauty. Some things are going down, so the range is actually being restricted because of changes in agricultural practices in Northern Europe. So really, we need numbers to build up before they can then move forward in a migratory pattern. So Bath white and a couple of the clouded yellows are declining in terms of the number of sightings. But there are three that hopefully will come back or colonize. So I mentioned the continental swallowtail. There's also a butterfly called the large tortoiseshell, which it is thought was a kind of sporadic migrant, but also took up residency. So it would have these sort of boom and bust years that were indicative of that kind of pattern. And then also the long-tailed blue, which I mentioned. So we're also seeing that every year now. And people in certain counties, especially Sussex, because there's quite a good population of entomologists in Sussex who do a lot of monitoring regarding long-tailed blue and large tortoiseshell, actually. Taking on board their work is painting a fairly positive picture of what we might start to see moving forwards. Well, I think I'll leave it there, David, just
Yeah,
as a
fascinating, very interesting seeing that that presentation. I sometimes feel a bit embarrassed, Pete, when I go to different parts of the world and they tell me, oh, we only got 370 butterflies in this particular area. How many have you got in England or in Britain?
Yeah.
Uh, 50 something. 50. I mean, why have we got so few? Is it purely to do with latitude and the further north you go, the less there is, or is it because we are just badly off?
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, theoretically, there's this theory of you know um, how many species can an island support. But I won't go into that. I think it is a combination of latitude. I think it's also a factor of we always say that the UK is kind of impoverished when it comes to nature generally, and I think that applies equally to butterflies. Gone are the wildflower meadow. Something like 98% of wildflower meadows have been lost in the last 50 years. But if you don't consider the whole life cycle of a butterfly, so adults need nectar, caterpillars need the food plants, and you also need to have the right conditions. Without those things, then it's very difficult for anything to survive. So I think the habitat loss is a massive factor when it comes to the small number of butterfly species that we have in Britain and Ireland.
Yeah,
Because a lot of it has been turned over to agriculture, and there's a lot of debates around neonicotinoids and pesticides and things like that, which really, really do have an effect on all insects and butterflies included. So,
yeah. Because we're not doing well, are we, in Britain? I mean, the
no, we're not.
insects per se are going through the floor, and also the butterfly conservation. They've had many surveys, and it seems like there's a downward trend generally, isn't it?
Yeah, something like 75% of our species have declined over the last 30 years, which is shocking. There are things that are moving north, like the comma and specklewood and gatekeeper keeper. So there are beneficiaries. But on the whole, yeah, we are losing both in terms of abundance and distribution, some species. And one of the fears is just in interject this as well, because I remember when I was a child, butterflies were everywhere. Is this shifting baseline syndrome, as I think that's the right phrase for it. So, what people experience today, or youngsters experience today, is nothing like what they would have experienced 30, 40, 50 years ago. But they don't realize that. I'm sure that's true of us as well. People of our, I mean, well, I don't know how old you are, David. I'm very old. And I'm sure the older entomologists would have felt the same way about, what it was like in my childhood as well. So yeah, it's just a battle we've got to keep fighting, I think. Um,
Yeah, I think you're dead right because people do think especially younger people, they see what they see now in terms of nature in general, and they think that's how it is when it wasn't
it's
like that
normal. Yeah.
before. I will talk about British butterflies in a second, but I just want to make one more point about butterflies per se, and that is, I'm not, I don't watch. By the way, if a moth person's a mother, what's a butterfly person?
I was going to say something derogatory towards mothers. Uh, I'll just say butterflies.
Butterfliers.
Yeah, there used to be a designation called Rhopalocera, and I was going to get a T-shirt that said Rhopalocera Rock, but I didn't. Um, but that used to be the separate. The interesting thing is taxonomically, the butterflies sit within the moths. You got moth, 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 butterfly, 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 moth, moth, moth. They kind of sit jammed in between all of the moths. So that designation of a butterfly and a moth is kind of semi-artificial. People give generalizations of, butterflies fly during the day, moths at night, which isn't true. Butterflies have clubbed antennae and moths don't. They're all exceptions to the rule in every case.
But
So
is there a division? I mean, are mothers interested in butterflies and vice versa,
yeah,
or is it
they
really?
definitely are. Definitely are. Um, I was talking to someone the other day about the behaviors of lepidopterists because a lot of mothers run moth traps. Butterflies don't run butterfly traps. Generally, that's not true in the tropics. But if you're someone who likes to get out in the countryside during the day, you get fresh air, go for a walk, you probably see more. There are day flying moths, of course, but you generally be seeing more butterflies than moths. Um, so, you know, butterflies tend to go out in the field and find butterflies, but a lot of mothers will run moth traps, which, of course, is the best way of monitoring moth populations. And they may take their moth traps to things like nature reserves, which is, a good way of actually assessing things like distribution and abundance in order to inform conservation efforts.
Yeah.
So yeah, just different behaviours. But I think it is true that everyone I've met is interested in Lepidoptera generally. Because you might come across a caterpillar and you think, God, that's very blingy. I wonder what that is. That's brilliant. And then you realise, oh, turns into a little brown moth. But the caterpillar's amazing. So you naturally get drawn to all of the life cycle stages of all Lepidoptera, whether it's a butterfly or a moth.
Yeah, it's interesting with the mothing because in Spain, mothing is illegal. You're not allowed to do
That's
any
right.
mothing unless you have a license. And I was
Yeah.
thinking,
You
what?
can't carry a net either. You can't carry a net
You
to
can't,
catch
you can't,
butterflies.
you can't do all that stuff, yet you can shoot birds.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword because you think, well, if you can't carry a net or do moth trapping, how can I monitor what's here? And you think, okay. So
Yeah,
yeah, you have to have a license to do those things.
yeah, I know a lot of people that do it illegally, but I won't say who they are. Um, but going back to my original question, just the global question for a second.
Yeah,
Everywhere I go, I see white butterflies, little cabbage white type jobs. And by the way, as I said earlier, I'm not a butterflyer,
yeah,
even a moth. I'm very interested, but I'm a bird brain.
yeah.
Um, they all look the same. I mean, you just showed two on one of the slides, and I was thinking, what's the difference? One's got slightly less black on its wingtip, but come on, I mean, there must be so many variations within each species. How the hell? I mean, I don't hear people talk about cabbage whites anymore. It's all, you know, black vein whites and stuff like that.
Uh, yeah, so first of all, you see them everywhere because some of these species are very widely distributed. So the same cabbage whites that you see in the UK, you'll see over all of Europe and beyond. Um, the cabbage white is actually a sort of colloquial term because there are two species. There's the large white and there's a small white. They get lumped together into the term cabbage white. Most people generally use the term to refer to the large white because it lays its eggs on can't say it. I'll say crucifers, but cabbages, cauliflowers, and things like that in batches. Because they lay their eggs in batches, when the caterpillars emerge, they do an awful lot of damage. And then the small white is guilty by association because it also lays on cabbages, but it lays its eggs singly. So it generally doesn't do as much damage as the large white. So really, it's the large white that's the cabbage white. But the differences between species can be, it's a spectrum. There are things which are obviously very different. You see a purple emperor, that's very different to a small white. But there are some species that you can only tell apart by dissecting their genitalia, where you can then this is done a lot in the mothing world, where there's kind of a lock and key mechanism between a male and female, and only that lock will go in. Sorry, only that key will go in that lock. So you examine the genitalia to determine whether or not this is of that species or some other species. And that's normally also done for conservation because, in order to monitor populations, I know it sounds contradictory to a conservation focused audience that this should go on, but it is, almost the last resort, I would say, of, if we do need to monitor these rarer species, then sometimes we need to go to that level. A good example is there's a butterfly called the wood white. And for years, until about 10, 15 years ago, we thought it was one species. Then it got separated into two, and then into three. Two of those three species are found in Britain and Ireland. So in Britain, we only have the wood white, and in Ireland, we have both the wood white and what's now being called the cryptic wood white that was separated. But if you were to look at them in the field, you would not be able to tell them apart. So
It's mind-boggling. In birding, we have areas of Britain that are really, people flock to for rarity. So, you go up to
yeah.
Shetland or you go to the Isles of Scilly or whatever. Is there a kind of an area within Britain that's good for finding rare butterflies?
Yeah, interestingly, for the migrants, quite often there are sightings on the Isle of Portland. So like with with the birds, the Isle of Portland often comes up with some good stuff. There's then a debate as to whether or not things were released there, but I think there have been genuine sightings of things. Um, but all along the south coast, for example, is that you can pick up things. Whether it's Isles of Scilly is a good one as well, a very good place to be, because quite often some of the migrants coming up from Northern Europe and also from North America first hit land at the Isles of Scilly. So I've never had a pager for a birder's pager, but I suspect some of those sightings also crop up using those paging mechanisms. I've seen a monarch on the Isles of Scilly, and last year there were several American painted ladies seen, along with green darner, dragonflies, and various bird species, all as a result of the same results of depressions blowing things off course. So I'd say the south coast. What I would say is that this is more of a plea, I suppose. A lot of people tend to go to the same places. They go to nature reserves where they know they're going to see the species that they're looking for. And I always try and encourage people to go to the sort of out of the way places that maybe nobody has looked at yet or recently. So go off piste, and who knows what you might find. It can be actually more interesting to find something new in a different area than going to the same old nature reserve that everybody's got 100 photos from.
Yeah, wise
And
words, Pete, actually, because I say the same with birding. Everyone rushes off to the same nature reserve or the same areas. Try somewhere different, find a new local patch.
yeah,
I've
definitely.
actually seen monarch butterfly on the Isle of Scilly before, actually, when I was there.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Um,
very good.
sorry, very good. You
Very
said.
good.
Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes.
But I've seen them in America. But my favorite butterfly I've always loved ever since I was a kid was Camberwell Beauty, and we've talked about it a few times today. And I remember seeing them in Finland, and I was so excited to see them. Um, and obviously they turn up as well, as you said, they kind of erupt now and again and turn up in the UK. But I'm really quite interested in this introduction stuff that goes on.
Mm.
Is there a law against it? Can you tell? I mean, is there suddenly like 5,000 of these butterflies found in this little spot in someone's field, or is that how you tell as an introduction of a species, or do people introduce things that are totally alien?
Um, Everything you've mentioned, I would say. So if you want to reintroduce a species or introduce a species to a new area, it's really just common sense that you would do a few things. One is you would make sure that the target habitat is in the appropriate condition. The food plants are there. There are nectar sources for the butterfly. And I'm specifically talking about butterflies that are quite colonial, because the widespread butterflies will probably find it anyway. If they're going to fly some distance, then you don't need to really focus on anything too special. Like a brimstone, if you plant some buckthorn in the majority of England, whether it's older buckthorn or just purging buckthorn, brimstones will find it and they will lay eggs and start to use it. But they're one of these butterflies that's sort of wider countryside butterfly. Whereas something more localized, like your silver-studded blue, if you wanted to introduce that to a new piece of heathland, you should probably look at the heathland, make sure, because that butterfly has a particular association with ants. So when its caterpillar is developing, it has a strong affinity with ants. It's called myrmecophily, so it benefits from ants protecting it essentially, and the ants benefit from some sugary secretions that the caterpillars give off. So you've got to get the habitat right. You've got to make sure all the right conditions are there. You've got to look at things like microhabitat. So is it warm enough as well? And then there's this question of some people talk about authorized releases and unauthorized releases. And for me, an authorized release is that you have the authority to collect specimens, whether it's eggs, caterpillars, pupae, or adults from the donor site. So you have the authority to do that. And you have the authority to release things at the target site. Because a lot of the sites that are suitable are actually protected in some way. whether they're a donor site or a target site. They could be a local nature reserve, they could be a triple SI, they could be whatever. So for me, an authorized release is one where you've actually got permissions, um, but there is no authority as such that is in control of introductions. There is also the law. So there are quite a few species where it's unless you have a license, it's illegal to disturb them even, let alone take them. And then there's it's the Wildlife and Countryside Act. There are species that you just cannot touch without a license, even disturb the land that they're on. And there are species that you can take, but you can't sell them on, which is a different section of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And yeah, so and then you end up with the other end of the spectrum that you were talking about, David, which is unauthorized releases. So people just getting some livestock and just dumping it somewhere and hoping for the best. And some of those do take. I mean, there are the Glanville fritillary butterfly is a good example. So its home is really on the south coast of the Isle of Wight. But we've got populations in Dorset. We've had them in near Weston-super-Mare. There's one at a place called Hutchinson's Bank near Croydon in Surrey. So these things will establish themselves. They may not survive there for a lengthy period of time, but they will survive for a little period before ultimately the conditions will be deemed unsuitable and they'll just die out. So that's why most people are fans of the first example. Get the conditions right. Make sure you've got a donor population that is healthy, and make sure you've got the permission to do things the right way, even though there's no authority as such. Butterfly conservation does give quite a lot of good guidance, and Natural England on how to do these things properly. So
Yeah,
they're worth looking at, even if you don't want to fill in all the forms.
yeah. I'm pretty sure I saw Glanville Fritillary on Alderney.
Yeah, you will. Yeah, the Channel Islands
Yeah,
are home to them, and Guernsey.
yeah.
Big
Um,
popular.
Stupid question perhaps, but do you know, like if someone went mental and put out, released an exotic, like from South America, on those bird wings or something, would they
Yeah.
survive?
No, generally not. No, because of the latitude that we're at. The conditions are unsuitable for the butterfly, then they will just die. Unfortunately, this is what I was saying earlier about people who want to rear butterflies. The first thing they should think about is not the food plant and things like that. It's what are you going to do with the adults? Because once they turned into adults, what are you going to do? So most people release them, and so you end up with some weirdness happening, things turning up, exotics turning up, and it's clearly a release.
Yeah,
There's also an unfortunate thing related to that in terms of people releasing butterflies at weddings and funerals, and sometimes the butterflies they release are some of these what we would call a vagrant, like monarchs, are being released. Few were seen in Brighton a few years ago, and it turned out that I think that was for a wedding party that had been going on. Everyone's getting very excited. Monarchs have turned up on the south coast, but yeah, it turned out to be a release from a wedding. So
right.
not a fan of that kind of behaviour personally.
No, nor am I. Life cycles, really interesting because, many novices, and I kind of include myself slightly in that bracket. You just,
Mhm.
when you think of butterflies, you think of butterflies. You never think of eggs.
Yeah,
You never think of caterpillars, you know, chrysalis. You don't really think of those things. You just think of the end result.
yeah.
What is it in terms of a life cycle on average? Is it just within the summer period, or do some butterflies actually exist for several years? I mean, what's the lifespan of these creatures?
So for British and Irish butterflies, the longest lived is probably a year, which is something like the brimstone butterfly. So it has a single generation each year that emerges in July, and it will actually survive as an adult over the winter, normally in a clump of ivy or something like that. It will mate the following spring, lay eggs, but you'll actually find the newly emerged adults of the next generation flying alongside those that were lagging behind from the previous generation the year before. So they have probably one of the longest adult um, stages. But of course, and there are butterflies that have multiple broods each year. So things like the common blue may have three generations each year. So the duration of each of those generations varies because those that happen in the spring and summer are relatively short compared to the one that overwinters, if you think about the whole life cycle, because it survives the winter actually as a caterpillar and then will emerge the following year. So the duration of each generation varies. But obviously for those butterflies that only have a single generation, they survive throughout the whole year. They overwinter in a particular stage. I think we have 6 butterflies that overwinter as adults, some as pupae, some as eggs, but the majority actually overwinter as caterpillars, which is why there's so much interest in things like insecticides and pesticides, because that can really hit them during that period when you get runoff from fields and things like that, actually affecting the food plant they're on, and then they eat that. But I'm not sure that answers the question. But I agree with you that people tend to think about just the adult butterfly. But
Yeah,
what you need to do is actually look at trying to. Here's a grayling. What you need is a phenology chart that tells you each stage. You can't see this, can you?
yeah,
Each stage and when you'll find it throughout the year. And that's a single brooded species and flies, June, July, August. But yeah, that's my plug for the life cycles. But
yeah. Good plug. I like it. I mean, as a final takeout, what advice would you give to people watching this who are not, fresh to butterflies and caterpillars and the whole sort of lifespan? What's the takeout message in terms of their conservation? How do what can you do in your little garden or whatever in Britain to save butterflies?
um, so there's been a focus, not just with butterflies, but other insect orders on this concept of wild spaces. If you add up all of the space that gardens take up in the UK, I don't know what the number is, but it's huge, absolutely massive. So there are things that you can do in your own garden to encourage butterflies. Um, but what I would say is um, think about the whole life cycle. It's not, don't just think about flowers that could be used as nectar sources. And by the way, some flowers that we grow, like daffodils, are pretty useless to Lepidoptera. But think about not just the nectar sources, but also the larval food plants, which for some people is like, oh, I don't want anything eating the plants I grow. But personally, I grow plants specifically for butterflies, now including a patch of nettles that often gets peacocks, commas, red admirals laying on them. So you can do your bit in your own garden, and then of course you can do your own bit in terms of signing up to a charity such as Butterfly Conservation or the Wildlife Trusts, and even RSPB do some good stuff regarding Lepidoptera in terms of things they're studying. But sign up to one of these charities, and they have work parties that manage nature reserves that they own or manage on behalf of other landowners. And that's a good way to actually connect with the broader community. And I've learned so much stuff from other people, so much. But you can't underplay the value of just going for a walk around with a David Linder if you're interested in birds, for example. So I join one of those organizations, help with their work parties, go on their field trips, and you'll learn so much. And that will be be invited to things like moth trapping events, or we're going to go and find some purple emperor caterpillars today, or whatever it may be. So that's an easy route in to actually fostering that interest, I'd say.
Fantastic. Okay, listen, I need to ask you a question, very important, perhaps the most important question today. Um, what is your favorite butterfly? My butterfly in Britain is even though it's not even here half the time, is the Camberwell Beauty. My favorite butterfly in Europe, by the way, is the Spanish festoon. I love the Spanish festoon. But anyway,
Yeah,
what is
very
your
nice.
favorite butterfly?
For me, it is. I kind of hinted at this. It's the white admiral. This thing here, because all of its stages are amazing. Um, it's got an egg that looks like a hairy golf ball. It's got a caterpillar that looks really exotic. It's got a crystal pupa that dangles upside down, and it's got a profile that looks like Punch, apparently, as in Punch and Judy shows. We'll never look at it the same way again. And the underside of the adult is really exotic as well. And I've been studying them for about 15 years in some local woods as well. So that's for me. I've learned a lot about them, and That's why they're on the cover of the book as well, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of other species, I've got a soft spot for the monarch butterfly. And the reason is when I was growing up, I had one of the Observer's Book of Butterflies, and it was the biggest butterfly in my very small butterfly book. I thought, I really want to see one of those one day. And I actually got to go to the overwintering roosts in California because they overwinter there as well as in Mexico. And yeah, seeing the clusters of monarchs. This was in February, just as they were warming up. So yeah, just amazing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Pete, for being here today, talking to us about butterflies, giving us a very brief introduction. Don't forget that Pete has two books, The Life Cycles of British and Irish Butterflies, and also his latest British and Irish Butterfly Rarities. So fantastic. So yeah, thank you very much, Pete, for being here
Yeah,
today.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoomers, the people here live now. Thank you very much. If you're watching this on YouTube in the future, please like and subscribe and tell all your friends about the wonderful variety of subjects on this particular series. And if you're watching this live anyway and not seen any previous ones, please check them out. And yeah, thank you very much. So until we all meet again, keep looking up.